March 10, 1943, Western Front, above the clouds of France. German pilots once called it der Fliegende Ziegelstein, the flying brick. To them, the new American fighter, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, was a joke, too heavy, too slow, and far too clumsy to survive a duel with a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf. They laughed, until the first burst of .50 caliber fire shredded the sky. 8 Browning machine guns, mounted on wings as wide as a bomber's, unleashed a storm of leads so fierce it could saw a fighter in half before the pilot even knew he was hit. What the Luftwaffe didn't realize was that this brick could dive faster than any aircraft in the world and climb back out of the fire still flying. Its armor could take hits that would tear most planes apart. And inside that steel monster sat pilots who refused to break. From the smoking ruins of France to the thunder over Berlin, the P-47 became a symbol of brute American will, ugly, unyielding, unstoppable. Because sometimes, victory doesn't come from beauty or grace. It comes from raw power and the courage to take a beating, then strike back harder. Let's go back to the day the Thunderbolt earned its name. March 10, 1943, Halesworth Airfield, Suffolk, England. The wind cut across the English countryside as rows of silver giants gleamed under a gray morning sky. The Republic P-47C Thunderbolt had finally arrived in Europe, and the men of the 56 Fighter Group gathered around their new machines with mixed emotions. For months, they'd flown nimble P-38 Lightnings and sleek P-51 Mustangs during training back in the States. But this was something else entirely. The Thunderbolt looked like it had been carved from steel and defiance, a monster of aluminum, nearly twice the size of the German Messerschmitt Bf 109. It weighed over 7 tons loaded, carried 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, and could climb into the sky on the roar of its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine, the same power plant used in bombers. But to most pilots, it seemed ridiculous. "You don't fly the Jug," one pilot muttered. Using its nickname, "You wrestle it." They weren't wrong. On the ground, the P-47 felt sluggish. Its takeoff roll was long, and its climb rate couldn't match the elegant German fighters dominating the skies over France. Even American mechanics laughed nervously, wondering if this overweight brute could survive a dogfight. German reconnaissance flights had already spotted the new American plane. At Luftwaffe headquarters in Paris, officers examined photos taken by Bf 109 G6 pilots. They smirked. "Look at it," one captain said. "It's a target, not a fighter." The German Air Force had ruled Europe since 1939. Their pilots, men like Adolf Galland, Walter Nauutny, and Erich Hartmann, were legends, flying lightweight, agile machines that danced through the air with lethal grace. Against that, the Americans had sent a tank with wings. The Germans laughed, but laughter would turn to shock. The first mission of the P-47 Thunderbolt into enemy territory began with a roar of 16 aircraft from the 63rd Fighter Squadron, led by Colonel Hubert Zemke, a veteran with nerves of steel and a reputation for discipline. Their job was simple: escort B-17 bombers striking German rail yards. But for Zemke, it was more than that. It was the Thunderbolt's trial by fire. The formation crossed the French coast at 400 miles per hour, the thick fuselages glinting in the morning sun. German radar picked them up immediately. Minutes later, the Luftwaffe came screaming down from above, a pack of Focke-Wulf FW-190As, led by Major Egon Mayer, one of the most feared pilots on the Western Front. The first dives tore through the formation. The FW-190s slashed past the bombers and climbed again for another strike. Zemke's radio crackled. "Bandits high at 2 o'clock. Let's see what this monster can do." He rolled his Thunderbolt over and dove. At first, the Germans didn't even break formation. They assumed the heavy P-47 couldn't keep up. But then something happened they hadn't seen before. The Jug began to fall like a meteor. Its weight and powerful engine made it the fastest diving aircraft in the sky, capable of breaking 500 miles per hour, faster than any German plane could safely follow. As Zemke pulled the trigger, the 8 Brownings thundered in unison. Tracers filled the air like molten rain. A Focke-Wulf disintegrated mid-turn, its wings shearing away in an explosion of smoke and flame. Seconds later, another 190 tried to escape by climbing, but the P-47 roared upward behind it, the turbo supercharger forcing air into its engine even at high altitude. Another burst, another kill. The Germans didn't laugh anymore. Reports from the 56 Fighter Group stunned the U.S. 8th Air Force. The P-47 had performed beyond expectation. No aircraft lost, 2 FW-190s destroyed, and the Thunderbolt's pilots returning safely. But the plane's secret wasn't just firepower or speed. It was toughness. Zemke's aircraft came back riddled with holes, yet the radial engine kept running. One Thunderbolt even returned with an entire cylinder blown apart, and still landed safely. "If you can get home," Zemke told his men, "the Jug will bring you back alive." That toughness became legend. The Thunderbolt squadrons spent the next months mastering their machine. They learned to use its high-altitude advantage, climbing above German formations before diving like hawks. They developed the deadly bounce tactic, a surprise attack from the sun, exploiting their superior diving speed. And as they adapted, their confidence grew. Lieutenant Francis Gabi Gabreski, a Polish-American pilot from the 56th, would later say, "At first, we thought it was a mistake, too big, too heavy. But the first time I saw what 8.50s could do to a 190, I fell in love." By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe began to take notice. The skies over northern France became graveyards for German aircraft. A formation of Thunderbolts from the 61st Fighter Squadron intercepted a group of Bf-109GS attacking B-17 bombers. German ace Hermann Graf, with over 200 kills, dove head-on into the American formation. But the P-47 pilots didn't flinch. They opened fire at 700 yards, far earlier than the Germans expected. The result was devastating. Graf's wingman vanished in a fireball. Another German fighter was torn apart mid-turn, its fuselage exploding under the hail of half-inch rounds. Graf himself barely escaped, his canopy shattered, trailing smoke all the way back to base. He later told his ground crew, "They're flying tanks. You can't out-dive them. You can't outrun them." The Luftwaffe's arrogance began to crack. The P-47 had earned its respect. By now, Zemke's Wolf Pack, the 56 Fighter Group, had become the most feared unit in the 8th Air Force. They painted snarling wolf emblems on their jugs, symbolizing the machine's spirit. Fast, fierce, loyal, and merciless. Each mission was proof that the Thunderbolt wasn't just a plane, it was a message. A message that America could build something massive, ugly, and utterly unstoppable. By the end of July, the Wolf Pack had claimed over 100 confirmed kills, losing only a handful of their own. The flying brick had become the hammer that shattered Germany's air superiority. As the summer heat settled over Europe, American bombers roared deeper into German territory: Hamburg, Schweinfurt, Regensburg. And above them, always, thundered the P-47s, silver giants carving contrails through a burning sky. The Luftwaffe had once laughed at the Thunderbolt. Now, when German pilots saw its silhouette glinting in the sun, they knew exactly what was coming. Not a joke, not a clumsy target, but death, carried on the wings of a machine that refused to die. Every war breeds a symbol, a weapon that defines the courage of its time. For the men who flew the Thunderbolt, that symbol wasn't about speed or elegance. It was about strength, about climbing into a machine that could take a beating, give it back tenfold, and still bring you home. And in 1943, that strength began to turn the tide of air war over Europe, one fiery duel at a time. August 17th, 1943, over Schweinfurt, Germany. The sky was a cathedral of smoke and death. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses droned across Germany's heartland, their bellies full of bombs destined for the ball-bearing factories that kept Hitler's war machine alive. Below them, black puffs of flak bloomed like poison flowers. Above them, the Luftwaffe waited. The mission was codenamed Operation Double Strike, a bold gamble to cripple German industry. But the bombers couldn't go alone. Their guardians, the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 56 Fighter Group, led by Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, were the first American fighters to escort deep into enemy airspace. And the Luftwaffe was ready. Zemke's radio crackled with static and fear. Bogies. 12 high, diving fast. German Bf-109GS and FW-190 as sliced through the clouds like knives. They came head-on, cannon fire flashing from their wings. Zemke's squadron broke formation. The sky erupted in chaos. Tracers screamed past cockpits. Wings flashed silver and gray. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, one of Zemke's rising stars, caught a burst of 20mm fire across his fuselage. His cockpit filled with smoke, oil splattered his goggles. He dove. The altimeter spun like a wheel of fate. A 190 followed him down, spitting fire. But the jug didn't quit. Johnson's armor held. His engine coughed, wheezed, then caught again. He pulled up, turned hard, and fired a 1-second burst. The .50 caliber Brownings thundered. The Focke-Wulf vanished in a ball of orange flame. When Johnson landed back in England, his Thunderbolt had 21 holes in its frame and still ran smooth. The mechanics just stared. That day, the Luftwaffe lost 60 fighters. The Americans lost 24 bombers, but none of Zemke's jugs. For the first time, the Germans realized. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter. It was a wall of steel and fury. Zemke gathered his men in the hangar. The air was thick with the smell of oil and sweat. He looked at the rows of tired faces, young men who'd seen hell and come back. "They think we're too heavy," Zemke said. "Too slow, too clumsy. But I've seen what you did up there. They're wrong. You've turned this brute into a killer." Silence. Then someone in the back yelled, "To the Wolf Pack." Laughter broke out. The 56 Fighter Group had earned its name, Zemke's Wolf Pack, a family of hunters who prowled the skies together, loyal to the last man. They began painting snarling wolves on their planes, jaws open, fangs bared, a symbol of the bond between the machine and the men who flew it. It started as a simple escort run for B-17s. By the end, it became one of the deadliest dogfights of the war. German ace Hermann Graf, the same man who once mocked the flying brick, led a formation of FW-190 as into the fray. He was a master of energy fighting, diving, striking, climbing away. But this time, the Americans dove faster. Lieutenant Francis Gabreski spotted Graf at 2 o'clock, diving on a bomber. He banked hard, flipped the jug on its side, and dove with the sun behind him. He fired a 2-second burst. 8 Brownings stitched across Graf's tail. The Focke-Wulf burst into flame and spiraled downward. Gabreski didn't celebrate. He just whispered to himself, "One more gone." By the time the squadron landed, 5 German fighters lay burning in northern France, all claimed by the Wolf Pack. As the months passed, something changed in the Luftwaffe. Reports from German ground radar began describing thick-bodied American fighters that dived like stones and climbed like demons. Luftwaffe Command issued a warning to all fighter wings. Avoid head-on engagements with the P-47. Break contact if caught in a dive. But pride is a dangerous thing. October 14th, 1943, the second raid on Schweinfurt. The Americans sent 291 bombers into Bavaria. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had, 300 fighters. In the middle of it all, 56 Fighter Group tore through the German formations. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin dropped out of the sun, ripping apart 2 Bf-109s in seconds. Gabreski caught an FW-190 head-on. Both pilots opened fire. The air between them turned into a wall of tracers. Gabreski's canopy cracked. The German's engine burst into flame. As he banked away, Gabreski's voice came over the radio. "Calm, steady. Keep your eyes open, boys. The wolves are still hunting." By sunset, the Luftwaffe had lost 38 fighters. The Americans had lost fewer than 10. The Luftwaffe was bleeding. Every day, the Thunderbolts pushed deeper into occupied Europe, striking airfields, convoys, and rail lines. The once invincible German Air Force was being hunted down in its own backyard. On November 26th, Zemke's Wolf Pack intercepted a flight of Me-110 heavy fighters over Belgium. They dove from 28,000 feet, opening fire with all 8 guns. In 15 minutes, 10 enemy aircraft were gone. Not a single jug was lost. That same week, Robert S. Johnson became America's first ace in the P-47, with 5 confirmed kills and a reputation for surviving the impossible. Snow blanketed the airfields, muffling the sound of war. Inside a small hut, Zemke read a letter from home, a simple Christmas card from his wife. Outside, mechanics worked through the cold, patching bullet holes, rearming planes, and readying for another dawn. For the men of the Wolf Pack, there were no holidays. Just the endless hum of engines, the roar of takeoff, and the hope of one more sunrise. They had become symbols, not of glory, but endurance. By the end of 1943, the Thunderbolt had transformed from a laughingstock into the backbone of America's air war. It wasn't the fastest or the prettiest or the easiest to fly, but when it came to survival, nothing matched it. Pilots said the P-47 didn't just protect them, it forgave them. It could bring them home with half its wing gone, oil streaming, cylinders blown, and still land safely. It was a fortress with wings, and behind that armor beat the hearts of men who refused to yield. That winter, Zemke wrote in his logbook, "The jug isn't perfect, but neither are we, and maybe that's why we understand each other." The Wolf Pack had proven that courage could be built from steel and thunder. But the real test was still to come. 1944, when Germany unleashed its deadliest weapons yet. June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. The dawn broke red over the English Channel. Below, thousands of ships stretched to the horizon, the largest armada in human history. Above them, the sky thundered with the sound of war. Operation Overlord had begun, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, D-Day, and leading the air assault were the same flying bricks the Germans once mocked, the P-47 Thunderbolts of Zemke's Wolf Pack and dozens of other fighter groups under the 9th Air Force. Their mission wasn't glamour or glory. It was survival. It was destruction. They flew low over the beaches of Omaha, Utah, sword and gold, raking German gun emplacements, tanks, and trucks with streams of fire. The sky was chaos, flak bursts, tracer fire, and black smoke. The air reeked of oil and salt. But the Thunderbolt didn't flinch. It could take hits that would rip apart any other fighter and keep flying. That day, its thick skin and roaring engine became the shield of thousands of Allied soldiers below. As one infantryman later said, "When we saw the jugs diving, we knew we had angels on our side." Captain Francis Gabreski led a sweep over the French countryside, hunting for German armor moving toward the front. They spotted a column of Panzer IVs snaking along a hedgerow road. Gabreski called out over the radio, "Wolves, line up. Let's show them what thunder really sounds like." The jugs peeled off one by one. Each pilot dropped his bombs at treetop height, the earth shaking as explosions rolled through the valley. Then came the 8 Brownings, pouring fire into tanks, trucks, and fleeing troops. The Panzers burned. The road vanished under dust and smoke. From above, Gabreski watched the scene, the flames, the chaos, the small dots of men running below. And for a moment, he whispered a quiet prayer. War wasn't about killing. It was about ending the need to kill. The 56th Fighter Group had moved to temporary airstrips carved out of the French countryside. Mud, rain, and wreckage surrounded them. They flew 6, sometimes 7 sorties a day, attacking rail lines, convoys, and bridges. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous, but now outnumbered and desperate. German ace Joseph Priller, flying an FW-190 A8, made one of the few Luftwaffe attacks on D-Day itself, strafing the beaches with his wingmen. But by the time he returned, the sky belonged to the Americans. Everywhere he looked, Thunderbolts prowled. The hunter had become the hunted. Colonel Hubert Zemke led a patrol near Paris when they spotted a formation of Bf-109GS attempting to intercept Allied bombers. Zemke gave the order. Wolf Pack dive. The jugs roared downward, engines screaming, contrails curling like claws. They hit the Germans from above in a perfect ambush. In less than 3 minutes, 7 enemy planes were down. One pilot, Lieutenant Ralph K. Jenkins, later said, "It was like watching steel tear through glass. The sky turned into lightning." For the Germans, the P-47 was no longer a laughingstock. It was a nightmare. Gabe Bresky was now the highest-scoring American ace in the European theater, 28 victories to his name. But he wasn't finished. He was due for leave back in the U.S., a chance to rest after 2 years of war. Still, he wanted one more mission. That morning, he flew over a German airfield near Koblenz, saw a row of parked aircraft, and dubbed to strafe them. On the pull-out, his propellers struck the ground. The jug shuddered. He tried to climb, but the engine died. Gabe Bresky crash-landed in a field and ran, heart-pounding, as German troops closed in. He evaded capture for 5 days before being caught and sent to Stalag Luft WWII camp. His war was over, but his legend had already been written. The Thunderbolts became the hammer that shattered the German front. They pounded enemy armor around St. Lo, Caen, and Falaise, turning roads into graveyards of steel. Their new weapon, 5-inch rockets, tore open tanks like paper. Each jug carried up to 10, making it a flying artillery platform. German soldiers began calling them J-bows, short for Jag Bomber, fighter bombers that struck without mercy. One captured German officer said, "When we saw the jugs circling, we threw ourselves into ditches." You cannot fight thunder. As Allied troops entered the city, the skies above were silent. The Luftwaffe was gone. For the men of the 56th, it felt unreal. They'd spent years fighting for every mile of sky, and now, finally, it was theirs. Zemke stood by his Thunderbolt, watching French civilians wave flags and cheer. He smiled, not in pride but relief. "Maybe now," he said quietly, "we can stop fighting the wind." Just when it seemed victory was certain, a new shadow appeared. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It could fly at over 540 miles per hour, faster than anything the Allies had ever seen. To the Thunderbolt pilots, it was like watching the future appear in the middle of a storm. On September 22nd, over Emden, a P-47 flight led by Lieutenant Urban Drew spotted a pair of Me-262s taking off. He dove hard, throttled every ounce of power from his engine, and fired just as one of the jets lifted from the runway. The .50 caliber rounds ripped into the fuselage. The jet exploded before it even climbed. It was the first confirmed Me-262 kill by a P-47 pilot. Even the future couldn't outrun thunder. Winter came. The air turned bitter, the missions longer and deadlier. The P-47s attacked fuel depots, trains, and bridges, anything that kept the German army alive. They called it the air war on the ground. Every convoy destroyed meant fewer bullets fired at Allied soldiers in the Ardennes. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December, Thunderbolts became lifelines, flying through snowstorms and flak to strike enemy tanks advancing on Bastogne. General George S. Patton himself said, "The P-47 is the damnedest thing ever built. Without it, we'd never have broken through." By the end of 1944, the Thunderbolt had flown more than 500,000 combat sorties in Europe. It destroyed over 86,000 rail cars, 9,000 locomotives, and 6,000 armored vehicles. Its pilots, once doubted, once mocked, had become legends. They weren't just fighting machines. They were men who faced death every sunrise and still climbed into the cockpit, because someone had to protect the skies. Zemke's Wolfpack alone claimed 665 aerial victories, more than any other U.S. fighter group in Europe. And through it all, the Jug never lost its soul, the sound of thunder that rolled over every battlefield, a reminder that strength comes not from perfection, but from perseverance. November 26, 1944, near Kassel, Germany. The sky was cold, metallic, and cruel. The war was entering its final act, but in that act, the Luftwaffe still had one last card to play. From a mist rose something no Allied pilot had ever seen before, a silver blur that sliced through the air like lightning. A Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first jet fighter. The Thunderbolt pilots watched in disbelief as the German jet roared past at 540 miles per hour, leaving only a shockwave and a trail of vapor. It looked like the future had come to kill us. Lieutenant Chuck Yeager would later say of his first glimpse. But even the future wasn't invincible. Captain Urban L. Drew, flying with the 361st Fighter Group, spotted two Me-262s taking off from Akmar Airfield. He dove hard, engines screaming, wings shaking, the jug fighting gravity itself. At 400 miles per hour, he opened fire. 8 Brownings thundered. The first jet exploded before its wheels left the ground. Drew shifted aim. The second burst into flame mid-air. 2 jets down in 30 seconds. Drew pulled up, his oxygen mask fogging as he whispered, "Not bad for an old prop." The Thunderbolt had done what no one thought possible. Outsmarted the jet. The ground shook as Hitler launched his final offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Blizzards blanketed the front, grounding most aircraft. But when the clouds broke, the Thunderbolts took to the air again, flying low, too low, searching for anything that moved. They strafed German convoys, tanks, and artillery, trying to crush the surrounded town of Bastogne. Major George Rags Rogotsky recalled, "We flew so low you could see the snow blast off the road from our prop wash. Every truck we hit meant one less shell fired at our boys. Each sortie was hell, ice clinging to wings, visibility near zero, anti-aircraft guns waiting below. Yet they kept flying. By Christmas, the Luftwaffe was broken. But so were the men, cold, exhausted, and haunted. At dawn, the airfield trembled under the roar of enemy engines. Dozens of FW-190s and Bf-109s swept in. The Luftwaffe's desperate Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise New Year's Day attack on Allied airfields. The P-47s were caught with engines barely warmed. Lieutenant Richard Dick Johnson sprinted to his jug under fire, jumped in, and took off through smoke and shrapnel. The moment his wheels left the ground, he fired. The first German fighter exploded at 200 yards. He climbed hard, turned, and dove again, a storm of bullets cutting across the airfield. When the battle ended, 56 Fighter Group had destroyed 21 enemy planes for the loss of only 2. It was the Luftwaffe's last gasp. By now, the Thunderbolts were more than escorts. They were the war's executioners. The 8th and 9th Air Forces had turned them loose on every supply line, bridge, and airfield left standing. Every morning, the Wolf Pack launched missions deep into Germany, leaving behind nothing but smoke and silence. Over Frankfurt, Cologne, and Dresden, the sky belonged to them. Even a mighty Me-262s could no longer turn the tide. Fuel shortages, inexperienced pilots, and shattered runways kept them grounded. Every time one tried to take off, a jug was already waiting. Colonel Hub Zemke had now led hundreds of combat missions. That morning, he flew at 25,000 feet, escorting B-17s heading for Berlin. Suddenly, flak bursts rocked his formation. Zemke's canopy shattered, his engine coughed, sputtered, and died. He bailed out at 15,000 feet, parachuting into enemy territory. German soldiers captured him before he hit the ground. As they marched him away, Zemke turned to look at the burning horizon. He lost his plane, but the sky was already won. Near Wesel, a formation of Thunderbolts encountered the Arado AR-234, a German jet bomber, sleek, deadly, and fast. The P-47s dove from above. One pilot, Lieutenant Walter Gross, fired a long burst at the jet's tail. The round struck true. The Arado broke apart in midair. It was one of the final aerial victories of a European war. Below them, German cities lay in ruins. The Reich was dying. Thunderbolt from a 78th Fighter Group made their final runs over Germany. Rail yards, bridges, and convoys were reduced to twisted metal. There was nothing left to fight. That evening, pilot Jack Price wrote in his diary, "We flew our last mission today. No opposition, no flak, just smoke. The war is ending. but the silence feels heavier than the sound. The guns finally fell silent. The war that began in fire ended in thunder, and the P-47 had been there through it all. From the beaches of Normandy to the skies over Berlin, it had carried its pilots through more danger than any machine ever should. Over 15,000 Thunderbolts have been built, more than 500,000 combat sorties flown, and the Wolfpack, Zemke's men, have become the most successful fighter group in the 8th Air Force, with over 665 confirmed kills. The Germans who once laughed at it were now gone, their laughter buried under rubble and regret. The Thunderbolt wasn't a beautiful plane. It didn't glide. It didn't dance, but it endured. It was the embodiment of the men who flew it, rough, determined, unbreakable. In every bolt, every rivet, every scratch on its armor was written the story of human resilience. The story of young men who climbed into a machine built not for grace, but for survival, and turned it into an angel of vengeance. When the war ended, many of those pilots went home and tried to live ordinary lives again. But they would never forget the sound, that deep, rolling thunder that meant they were still alive. May 20th, 1945, Clark Field, the Philippines. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and jungle rain. The war in Europe was over, but in the Pacific, it was only reaching its most desperate stage. As one war ended, another began for the Thunderbolt. New units of P-47S, the long-range variant with extended wings and massive fuel tanks, arrived at airfields carved from coral and mud. Their mission: to escort bombers on 1,500-mile runs across the endless blue toward the heart of Japan itself. The pilots had traded the frozen skies of Europe for the suffocating heat of the Pacific. But the enemy here wasn't just distance. It was men who wanted to die. The largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War raged below. On land, American Marines clawed their way through ridges and caves. Above, the sky was chaos, hundreds of planes twisting in lethal dance. From the east came the shriek of engines, kamikaze squadrons diving from the clouds. They didn't dogfight. They didn't flee. They aimed straight for ships, ready to die for the Emperor. Captain Henry Hank Myers of the 507th Fighter Group throttled forward in his P-47 in Judy Baby 2. Below him, a formation of Navy destroyers braced for impact. Myers dived, guns blazing. 8.50 caliber Brownings cut through the air like ripping canvas. One kamikaze exploded mid-dive, another lost a wing, but a third kept coming. Myers rolled, inverted, dove again, and fired until the barrels glowed red. The Japanese plane disintegrated 50 feet above the ocean, raining fragments into the surf. The destroyer below rocked, but it lived. "They came to die," Myers later said. "We came to make sure they didn't take anyone with them." The Thunderbolts became flying fire brigades, launching dozens of sorties each day, strafing landing zones, bombing in trench positions, and intercepting kamikazes before they reached the fleet. The pilots began to recognize patterns, faint glints in the sunlight that meant an enemy plane was diving from the high clouds. It became a deadly game of reaction and nerve. Lieutenant Robert Hodge, flying with the 413th Fighter Group, wrote in his diary, "Every time you see a flash in the sun, your heart stops. You wonder if this is the one that gets through." They didn't always win. On June 21st, a kamikaze slammed into the destroyer USS Twiggs, killing 126 men. The next morning, the Thunderbolts returned, their guns and bombs carving a burning path of vengeance through the skies. By the end of June, Okinawa was secured, at a cost of 12,000 American dead and nearly 100,000 Japanese defenders. But the skies had been tamed by the Thunderbolt. The new Thunderbolts gleamed in the Pacific sun. These weren't the early European jugs. The P-47N had longer wings, more range, and a monstrous fuel load, 2,300 miles if stretched to the limit. Enough to escort B-29s from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back. That morning, they launched one of the longest fighter missions in history. Nearly 8 hours round trip, flying in formation with the 20th Air Force's Super Fortresses. Over Japan, the sky shimmered with haze and smoke. Anti-aircraft bursts dotted the air. But the Thunderbolts pressed on, strafing airfields, shooting down interceptors, and blasting trains that tried to move what little fuel Japan had left. At Chofu Airfield, near Tokyo, Lieutenant Jack Hedges destroyed 3 parked planes before a burst of flak tore through his left wing. He managed to limp his jug 700 miles back to base, on a single engine, oil spraying across the canopy. When he landed, the ground crew stared at the holes in his fuselage. The mechanic whispered, "This thing just refuses to die." Japan was collapsing. Cities burned nightly under B-29 firestorms. But their pilots still rose to fight, desperate, fearless, doomed. The Thunderbolts encountered remnants of the 343rd Naval Air Group, elite Japanese pilots flying Kawanishi N-1K-2, J. Shidenkai, George fighters, fast and deadly at low altitudes. In one brutal dogfight over Kyushu, Major Ben Mayo led a section of P-47NS against 4 of them. The battle twisted across the sea, spirals of vapor and smoke trailing in the humid air. Mayo's voice crackled over the radio. "They're good, but not good enough." He rolled inverted, line of a burst, and one Shidenkai vanished in flames. By the end of the fight, all 4 Japanese planes were down. None of the Thunderbolts had been lost. That morning, the world changed. The B-29 Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb. Thunderbolts patrolled the skies hours later, ensuring no Japanese interceptors tried to retaliate. But there was nothing left to stop. 3 days later came Nagasaki. Then silence. When Emperor Hirohito's voice broke across Japanese radio, announcing surrender, the men at IE Shima stood quietly beside their Thunderbolts. No cheers, no celebration, just exhaustion and relief too heavy to name. Some cried. Some just stared at the ocean. The flying brick that once fought across Europe's clouds had crossed the Pacific, survived kamikazes, and watched history's darkest weapon in the war. It had done everything a machine could do, and more. After the war, thousands of Thunderbolts were scrapped, melted down for peacetime metal. But those who flew them remembered. They remembered the roar on takeoff, the smell of burnt oil and cordite, the tremor in their bones when the 8 guns fired in unison, and the strange comfort in knowing that when everything else failed, the jug would bring them home. Colonel Hub Zemke, reflecting years later, said, "The P-47 wasn't the fastest, but it was the one that forgave your mistakes. It took punishment and still loved you back. If you believe machines can have souls, then the Thunderbolt had one. It carried boys through hell and brought men back." Share its story. Remember the sound of thunder that shook 2 continents. Because when you forget the machines that protected freedom, you forget the men who gave them life. The P-47 Thunderbolt, born in mockery, risen in fire, and remembered in thunder. A legend not of beauty, but of strength. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay. The guns had gone silent. The air was still, almost unreal, as the USS Missouri lay anchored beneath a gray sky. Above her, circling in perfect formation, were the planes that had earned this peace. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, B-29 Super Fortresses. The war that had consumed the world was finally over. And among the rumble of engines and the smell of fuel, a handful of pilots stared down from their cockpits. Men who had survived 2 worlds of war, from the frozen skies of Europe to the burning clouds of Okinawa. Men who had watched friends vanish in smoke and flame, yet somehow made it home. For them, this wasn't victory. It was closure, the kind only those who have seen hell can understand. The Thunderbolts came home, just as their pilots did. They landed on quiet American airfields, rows of tired machines lined up like old warriors waiting for rest. Some were sold for scrap. Some ended up as gate guardians, mounted on poles at forgotten air bases. A few went to National Guard squadrons, their roar echoing through peaceful skies. The world had entered the jet age now. The P-80 Shooting Star and F-86 Sabre would soon rule the heavens. But the men who had flown the Jug never forgot what it had given them and what it had cost. In a small hangar where the Republic Aviation Factory once churned out 1,000 planes a month, a reunion was held. Old pilots, Zemke, Johnson, Gabreski, gathered again. They laughed, they drank, they remembered. Someone hung a faded sign that read, "Once you've flown a Jug, everything else is just a plane." Gabreski, who had ended the war with 28 aerial victories, stood up and said quietly, "They called it the flying brick, but it never dropped us." A murmur of agreement filled the hangar. These men had outlived the war, but not the memories, not the faces of the ones who hadn't come back. When the next war came, the Thunderbolt returned under a new name, the F-47. It strafed rail lines and supply columns in Korea, its .50 caliber guns once again thundering over frozen valleys. Even as jet fighters screamed above, the old piston legend proved its worth. Tough, reliable, fearless. A relic, yes, but one that refused to die. Europe rebuilt itself from the ashes, and in the skies above, a few surviving Thunderbolts found new homes. In France, Brazil, Mexico, even Yugoslavia. Children would point at them as they roared past during parades. Most had no idea that those same engines once filled the sky with death and freedom. Every summer, at air shows across America and Britain, that sound returns, the unmistakable growl of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine. A restored P-47 May, once sunk in an Austrian lake, now flies again, polished silver glinting in the sun. Crowds look up as the pilot pushes the throttle forward. And for a few seconds, the world hears thunder again. Children cover their ears. Veterans close their eyes. And in that sound, raw, mechanical, alive, history breathes once more. The Thunderbolt was never elegant. It didn't dance like a Spitfire or glide like a Mustang. It fought like a brawler, trading blows until the other side couldn't stand. But maybe that's why it's remembered. Because in war, and in life, it's not always the graceful who survive. It's the ones who can take the hit and keep fighting. Every dent in its fuselage told a story. Every patch of scorched paint whispered a name. And every pilot who flew it carried those goes for the rest of his life. "When I flew the Jug," said pilot Bill Dunham, "I felt like I had armor on my wings and courage in my hands." They weren't just flying machines. They were lifelines. A partnership between man and metal, forged in fire, bound by trust. By war's end, 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts have been built. They flew more than 746,000 sorties, dropped over 132,000 tons of bombs, and fired millions of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. They destroyed 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air and thousands more on the ground. But beyond the numbers, the Thunderbolt left something greater, a legacy of endurance. Today, only a few dozen survive, kept alive by engineers, veterans' families, and dreamers who refuse to let them fade. Each time one flies, it's not just a plane taking off, it's a promise kept. A reminder that courage is not about speed or elegance. It's about grit, steel, and the will to rise through the fire again. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. Not just the rumble of engines, but the echo of men who refuse to break. Boys barely 20 years old, flying into storms of flak, laughing, swearing, praying. Men who looked death in the eye and pulled the trigger anyway. They are gone now, but the Thunderbolt carries their memory like a metal pinned to its heart. Because heroes don't always wear capes or stand on pedestals. Sometimes, they climb into a roaring metal beast and bring thunder to the dark. If this story moved you, share it. Because history doesn't live in books. It lives in the sound of engines, in the names etched on wings, and in the courage of those who refuse to fall. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't supposed to be a legend. It was supposed to be a joke, a flying brick. But when the world needed thunder, it roared.